Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to Unity Christian, Unity High School students, 284 of us. We have some guests. We have homeschoolers and their parents that have joined us in the middle section. Let's give them a welcome. We have some kids from local public schools that are here as well, so thank you for coming. You came as individuals and families, so welcome to you as well. We have Orange City Christian Middle School up in the corner there. We're pretty fired up. And we're all kind of fired up because it's Friday. It's been a great week. We've got a lot of things accomplished. Next week, we're pretty excited here at Unity. Our volleyball team's going to state, and so we have a very short week next week, so we're kind of excited about that. But we're really excited to hear our speaker today, and would just like to say a few words of welcome and a little bit about our speaker. When I was 10, I remember my mom came home from the Christian bookstore and she had this little cartoonish book. I think it was called Gates of Splendor. And I would call it a comic book, although it wasn't a funny story. It was a sad story. It was a story of a missionary, Jim Elliot, and his friends who were killed bringing the Lord to a tribe of people that had not heard of Jesus before. And that was a very powerful story. And I remember it when I was young, when I think I was about 10 years old. Wow, I don't know how many years ago this movie came out, but there's a movie called The End of the Spear. Raise your hand if you've seen this movie. Wow, a lot of you. I know here at Unity, we watched scenes of this last week in chapel to kind of prepare for today. And I think in World Cultures class, the entire movie, I believe, is watched as well. And The End of the Spear, again, is the story of Jim Elliot and his friends. We are really pleased today to welcome Valerie Elliot Shepard, the daughter of missionary Jim Elliot, to our chapel today. I believe she's doing a missions conference tomorrow, and lots of people are coming to that here at Unity. And we're just excited to have her. Valerie and her husband Walter have spent 41 years in ministry. She's the mother of 8 children. She has taught many Bible studies. She's a speaker, a missionary, and a church planter, and today she is sharing her story with us. Will you please join me in welcoming Valerie Elliot Shepard?
Thank you. Thank you. Before you show any pictures on the screen, I'll just tell the basic story, and then we'll look at the pictures. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here. I was your age once, long, long time ago, and I'm also happy to be in a Christian school. You are very privileged to be in a Christian school. My mother homeschooled me, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade in the middle of the jungle. We were in the Amazon jungle in Ecuador. My parents met each other at Wheaton College in Illinois, both of them very sure that the Lord had called them to the mission field. They met because they were both in Greek and wanted to translate the original Greek New Testament into a language, whatever language the Lord called them to work with. They fell in love, but my father told her the surprising thing that he was sure of, that God had called him to be a single missionary. That was pretty awful news for my mother when she realized she had fallen in love with him. So for 5 years, they were in different parts of the country and preparing for the mission field. After my mother graduated, my father graduated a year later, but they started writing letters, and they were very much in love, but they were very, very sure of one thing. They had to do the will of God before they could give in to their feelings and their love for each other. My father was just not sure whether God would ever let him get married. So, of course, my mother didn't know whether she would get married to this man. And they only saw each other 5 times in 5 years for very short visits. So a book is coming out in February of their love story that I have put together. And it has all their letters, almost all their letters, and many, many journal entries. So I'm very thankful to share that story with the world. I'm also very thankful to just be their daughter. because even though I don't remember my dad, I was 10 months old when he was killed. They both, my father and mother, stood for obedience to God. How many of you kids have been challenged to obey God first? Can you put up your hands if you have been challenged to obey God first? Okay, a few tentative ones. Well, I hope someday you will say, I'm there. I want to obey God before my own feelings come in front of that. So they wrote to each other, and then they eventually ended up in Ecuador 2 months apart from each other and had to learn Spanish together, and their love blossomed even more. But my father was still saying, I need to be a single missionary to the jungle Indians for a year before I will know whether I'm supposed to get married. He had been told that women could not handle the Amazon jungle. How many of you girls think you could handle the Amazon jungle? I bet many of you could. Most of you probably could. Yes, there are dangers, but it was the climate that back then they used to say women can't take that. My mother was a strong and brave and healthy woman, very healthy. So once my father began to recognize her strength, not only in Quito as they climbed mountains together, but then they went to two different parts of the jungle. My father went to the Amazon jungle, my mother went to the other side of the Andes, the western side, and both were working with Indians. So as they wrote to each other, eventually my father recognized that God was calling him to marry my mother. So in 1953, they got married. I was born in 1955. They worked among Quechua Indians, who are a little bit more civilized. But during their college years, they had heard about the Auca Indians, who are now called the Waodani. And if you have seen End of the Spear, it is about the Waodani Indians and what happened with the 5 men. There's even a wonderful documentary that my mother made in 1958 called Through Gates of Splendor, which is also the same name of that comic book that your principal read when he was 10. And there is a book that has been published since 1958, Through Gates of Splendor, that is still a bestseller among Christian bookstores. So my mother kept on writing books, but when we were in the jungle, we had the opportunity to go and live with these Indians that had killed my father. Now, a lot of people think that these 5 men were real martyrs for their faith, but if you have studied what a martyr is someone who stands for his faith and is told to give it up or he will be killed. And Muslims are doing this to Christians. They're saying, if you will give up who you believe in and bow to Muhammad, then we won't kill you. But there are Christians being killed because they are standing up for what they believe. Well, actually, these 5 men were being friendly to the Indians, who were called Aucas, now called Waodani, and they were dropping gifts to these Indians for 15 weeks in a row. They dropped a bag of gifts. Actually, it was in a bucket, and they just gave useful things in the bucket. This plane would fly over their little village. There were 40 people in the tribe, 10 men, women, and children. So many of the men had been killed among the Indians because this tribe was known as a very savage, killing tribe. So these men and women began to see this plane come every week in 1955 and drop this bucket, which stayed on a cable attached to the plane. And they dropped this gift, and the Aucas began to take the gift out, and within 2 to 3 weeks, the Aucas began to replace the gift with their gift. One of their gifts was a pet parrot, a macaw. Another gift was the little combs they made for their thick black hair. Another gift was a roasted monkey's paw. Now, they ate monkey all the time, so they roasted it over a fire, and you always had the taste of burnt fur in the monkey meat. And so these gifts were brought 15 weeks in a row. And when these men would come, actually it would be the pilot and one of these 4 men that were killed with my father. They each had a turn going with the pilot and yelling out of a megaphone in the Auca language, "We want to be your friends. We've come to meet you. Come to meet us." And the Aucas began to wave, and they called it the yellow bumblebee that came. They didn't know anything about machines or the outside world. And they were a naked tribe. They didn't know anything about clothing, didn't see the point of clothing at all. So this is what began to happen. They saw this plane coming, and this gift they thought fell out of the stomach of the bumblebee. And eventually, Nate Saint, who was the Missionary Aviation Fellowship pilot, found a place that was within walking distance of this little village of Indians. And he found a place he could land the plane, and the 5 men prayed and prepared and planned to be on that beach to meet these Indians for as long as they could, as they would want to get to know the language, because they only knew a few phrases they had learned from one Auka, Waodani, who had fled the tribe because of hostility and violence. So they would say, "We want to be your friends." They would wave, and eventually Nate Saint found this beach. My father prepared a wood fabricated tree house that they could live in. They would have 4 men sleeping up on the tree house, and then 1 on the beach on guard, because pumas, panthers, snakes could come, and of course the snake could go up the tree, so there was always a man watching every 4 hours. And within a couple days, 3 Indians from the tribe they'd been dropping the gifts to came and visited with them for the afternoon. They had no spears with them, that's how they killed. They had killed a few Shell oil workers a few years before this happened. So they were suspicious of these white men, but they knew the white men had been dropping gifts to them. So 2 women and a man came out from the tribe, and they spent the afternoon. They ate hamburgers for supper with the 5 men, and then they went home in the evening. Well, the men were very happy and excited because it had been a friendly, face-to-face contact with them. And 2 days later, Nate Saint, the pilot, and by the way, End of the Spear, the movie, is mainly about Nate Saint from the son Steve's perspective. So it's not about my dad, but of course my dad was one of the men. Nate Saint flew over the village to wave at the people, and he saw nobody came out from under the houses. They lived in thatched roof huts with no walls. And he radioed back to his wife, which he did at least twice a day when he was in the air, to tell her what was happening. And he told her that the Indians were gone from the village. They didn't come out from under their houses, and it was completely empty. No, not even children were running about. So he said, "Well, we hope that they are coming to the beach." They figured it was about a 3-hour walk from where their village was to the beach, and they called it Palm Beach. And then in the afternoon, when Nate Saint went back to his group of men, and he had been going daily for supplies, because the plane can't hold many weeks' worth of supplies, he came back and he said to the men, "I think they're coming this way because their village is empty." He told his wife that he would call her at 4:30 on this shortwave radio from the plane. So he did not call at 4:30. The wife was listening, waiting, and she knew her husband was always very quick and prompt to call at the time he said he would call. So she waited. She called the radio call number for him. There was no answer. By 7:30, that was 4:30 in the afternoon, she didn't hear. By 7:30, she had alerted every one of the wives, that's 4 different wives besides her, that something had happened to the guys because they hadn't called. And by Monday morning, they still hadn't heard anything. They hoped that the men were being held hostage by the Indians, so they sent out a search party on Wednesday. They still were trying to call. Actually, the Ecuadorian Army and the American Air Force flew over in a helicopter on 2 different days. One of them did not see anything. The second one did see bodies in the water. And so when the search party arrived on Friday, this was from Sunday when they hadn't heard from them. Friday, the search party, they'd been walking from the different Quechua villages that had sent some Indians and a missionary with them to find the bodies. And they found 4 of the bodies riddled with spears, all of them still in the water. One body had floated downriver where a Quechua had found it later, a couple of days later. So these men didn't actually get to be martyrs like they are called, but in a figurative sense, they went because of their faith. They sang a song before they got there with their wives all together at Christmas time. They sang, "We rest on thee, our shield and our defender. We go not forth alone against the foe, strong in thy strength and in thy keeping tender. We rest on thee, and in thy name we go." They sang that all together. One of the wives said, "You know that you may be killed." They all knew the danger because these Indians were known as killers. And the husband said, and I don't remember which one it was, it might have been Nate Saint, he said, "We're ready to go to heaven, but they're not. They need to know the gospel." So their hope was that they would learn enough of the language as they continued these friendly contacts that they would be able to tell them about Jesus. But what had happened among the Indian tribe is after those 3 visitors came on the Thursday or Friday afternoon, they had gone back, and the younger woman had said, "I think they're cannibals. I think you should go and kill them." So it was just the whim of this young woman. They had been suspicious of white men. There's no cannibalism in Ecuador, so they must have thought that white men must be cannibals. They had no experience of good, friendly white men. So that's how it got started. The Indians decided from Friday to Sunday, talking and talking and talking. There were several who said, "I don't think they're cannibals. They've been kind to us. They've been good to us." And then there were several who were saying, "No, they're tricking us. They're going to kill us and eat us." So that's why they went and ambushed the 5 men and killed all 5 of them. Now, when Nate Saint said, "They're not ready to go, but we are," they were going in faith and in obedience to this Indian tribe, wanting to share the gospel. So we're going to show some pictures of what it looked like in Ecuador. And I got to live with these Auca Indians when I was 3.5, and that all happened because my mother had continued to pray, as all of the wives had continued to pray for these Indians. Lord, they need the gospel. When my father was in college, he had written in his journal, "Lord, I want to sing over the Aucas." And that meant he wanted to see them come to Christ, and then everybody would sing and rejoice because souls were saved. But he never got to actually sing over the Aucas, probably until later in heaven, when many Aucas decided to follow Jesus. So that happened when I was 3.5, and we were invited to live with the tribe. So we'll go through some pictures. I think I need to move. All right, can all of you see it, or is this in the way? Okay, let's go. Ecuador. Anybody know what the word Ecuador means? You can yell it out. Yes, equator, thank you. So it was right on the equator. We had sunshine at 6 o'clock in the morning and sunset at 6 o'clock in the evening all year round. Time never changed. We had a rainy season and a dry season. But in the jungle, Amazon jungle, we had rain once or twice a day in the dry season and 3 to 4 times a day in the wet season. Okay, so we were to the east of Quito, where we lived, was where the Quichuas were. And the Aucas were just a couple days' walk from where the Quichuas were. You can go to the next slide. These are some of the creatures that live in the Amazon jungle. I'm sure some of you have studied this, what's in the Amazon. And that ocelot in the middle was caught one night by the Auca Indians that we lived with. They came and woke us up because their chickens had been disappearing every night. And they made a trap. And there was the ocelot in the trap. They woke us up during the night. We went with a flashlight over to the cage they had built, and this thing was snarling and just as mean as a tiger, but much smaller than a tiger. So that's a very common animal in the jungle. The monkey up in the your right-hand corner up there is a very popular pet among the Indians, and I had one, but I think they're mischievous and naughty, so I don't like monkeys. We had a parrot. They're always making lots of noise. So even though they're beautiful, they're very noisy. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is my mother and father on the day of their wedding in 1952. They got married in a civil ceremony. That just means they went to a judge in Quito who married them. And they were supremely happy because they had been in love for 5 years. And now they knew God had given them the go-ahead to get married. And they found a verse in the scripture that said, "This is our God. Lo, we have waited for him." Go on to the next slide. This is the first house. Actually, my mother and father lived in a tent first that was so leaky, continually getting more leaks, that my father worked on a house built of bamboo and thatched roof and screen windows. So they got married in October 1953, and this was in February and March they got to move into the house. My mother thought she was in a palace compared to being in the tent. To the next slide. This is my father with one of the Quichua Indians. Quichuas are the biggest indigenous tribe in both Peru and Ecuador, and their language is very similar to Spanish and not too hard to learn. So my father had told my mother, "You have to learn Quichua before we get married," and she learned it in 3 months because she wanted to get married. So next slide. This is the beginning of our home being built in Shandia, which was a Quichua mission station, and that's where my father and Pete Fleming worked for almost a year before he realized that God was going to give him a wife. And so there was Grandpa Howard, you can't see it, Grandpa Elliot, excuse me, my father's father came down from Portland, Oregon to build this house. It had concrete floors. It had concrete up to about waist high, and then it had screen windows and a tin roof, and it had running water, so it was an even better palace for my mother to move into. And that's the house I lived in until I was 8, other than the 2 years we lived with the Aucas. Next slide. This is my father holding a snake. You can't see it very well, but it is wrapped around his wrist and his fingers, and it is a non-poisonous snake, but there are lots of snakes in Ecuador, and he was rather brave, so he just enjoyed having that picture taken of him. Next slide. My father on the beach where the men were killed, and he has a feather crown made out of macaw feathers, and this was one of the gifts that the Aucas had sent back up in the bucket when the men had been dropping a bucket weekly. Next slide. Isn't that beautiful? It's the Amazon jungle, and this is called a tributary of the Amazon River. There are many, many, many tributaries from the Amazon. So this is just a little river called the Curaray River, and this is where Palm Beach was. Nate Saint was very skilled to be able to land his plane on soft sand. You usually can't do that with a little plane, but he was able to. Okay, next slide. This is not an Indian that I remember, but this is exactly what the Aucas looked like. And if any of you have wanted to have gauges in your ears, this is what your ears will look like as you get older. They stretch out and they look pretty ugly. So there you go. That's a Waodani. That is their own people name. That's their people group name, the Waodani. Okay, next slide. My father on your right, and Pete Fleming, and Ed McCulley. My father and Ed were both at Wheaton together. Ed was bound for being a very good lawyer because he won all the debates in oratory and won oratory prizes. And Pete Fleming was going to be an English professor in Seattle, Washington, and my father convinced both of them that they should go to the mission field. And so he was the one that really drew them to Ecuador, but they prayed. Of course, they prayed a lot about whether they should go, and they felt God called them to Ecuador. And that is the parrot that was sent up in the bucket. Next slide. This is the tree house they lived in for almost a week. Next slide. And these are the 5 men that were killed. Roger Youderian was quite a hero in World War II. He helped fight against the Germans in Holland, and as I said, Pete Fleming was going to be a professor. My father was one that went to Wheaton and majored in Greek. Nate Saint was a pilot. He had been in the Army also, and Ed McCulley, as I said, was bound for either a football career or a lawyer career, and all of them felt called to go to Ecuador. Next slide. So this is the day that the 3 Aucas came and had a friendly visit with the 5 men. And you can see from Nate Saint's face, they're very happy, and he had been showing him this little model balsam wood airplane and how the airplane landed. And the Auca was fascinated with it, but he also wanted to ride in the airplane. So Nate took him up in his plane, flew over the little jungle, and when he saw the houses and the people come out from under the house, he started to open the door to the plane to get out, and Nate had to grab him and say, no, you can't go out there. So that's, they called him George, but he eventually was one of the killers. And he also has balsa wood in his ears. Next slide. This is me. My mother thinks it was the very afternoon that my father was killed, so you can understand why I don't remember him as a baby. But what I know about my father is that he was totally dedicated to obeying God, standing for Christ. And I'm very, very thankful that I got to live in the jungle, both among the Quechua Indians and then later among the Auca Indians. It was a very unusual thing that my mother and I were invited to live with the Aucas. It was because 2 women fled their tribe, the same tribe that we knew, because of violence. People kept getting killed. And these 2 women arrived at a Quechua house. We lived 3 hours from that Quechua house. One of the Quechuas came and told my mother, 2 Auca women have come to our house. Probably the men are hiding in the trees and they're going to kill us all. The Quechuas were very afraid of the Aucas. And my mother went right away with her tape recorder and a notebook, and she took this 3-hour walk and met these 2 women. And they were perfectly blasé, happy to be at the Quechua house. Of course, they couldn't communicate. The Quechuas couldn't communicate with them, but they were there because they had run from the violence that was in their village. And you can go to the next slide. This is a baptism that one of the missionaries was able to do this was a Quechua Indian. Later on, some of the Waodani Indians were baptized with Steve Saint when he was older. And the wonderful thing is, next slide, my mother and I in Shell, which was the place where Mission Aviation Fellowship had their plane and the station where all of the missionaries went to first before they went out to the jungle. But Nate knew that these missionaries in different parts of the jungle always needed supplies. They needed food as well as medical supplies. And so that was his job every day, flying supplies to the different jungle stations. And Roger Udarian and his wife were at one jungle station, and Pete Fleming and his wife were at another jungle station, and my mother and father, etc. So we had come into Shalmetta probably to have a dentist look at our teeth. So that was that day. Go on to the next slide. This is me in the Quechua house where the 2 Auca women had come. I keep switching between Auca and Waodani, and I'll explain that. The Quechuas called the Aucas that word Auca because it meant savage to them. And when they came to understand who God was and who Christ was through my mother, Dayuma, and Rachel Saint, they said, we don't want to be called Aucas anymore because we're going to stop killing. And they just decided like that. They all decided they should not kill anymore. And that's how those 2 women who came to this house, my mother invited them to come live with us. And they stayed with us almost a year, and my mother slowly was beginning to learn their language. And at the end of that time, they said, we're going back to our village. We want you to come with us, and that other lady, Rachel Saint, because we want you to tell us about God. We know that killing is wrong. So they had their own moral code. Some of you in high school have heard the people groups all over the world have their own moral codes. And we have in the Bible that we have eternity in our hearts. So we know there's a God, even if we've never heard of Jesus. The Aucas knew there was a God. They knew there was a creator before anybody had gone to tell them that. And they didn't know about Jesus. So when Dayuma and my mother and Rachel came to tell them, they said, we want to follow God's trail. Next slide. This is my mother with one of the Auca Indians, and she is one of the women that was first came out of the tribe to visit the Quechuas and then invited us back to live with them. This is my mother and me, obviously. I'm perfectly happy. when you all were 3 and 4 and 5, you didn't care whether you lived in Iowa or wherever you lived. You lived wherever your parents had brought you. And so I knew there were some dangers, but I was not really afraid of much. So I was perfectly happy playing with the Indian children. Next slide. I had a birthday when I turned 4. A cake was sent with the parachute. The airplane dropped weekly for us. And so I had a birthday party with my little friends. My mother used to say in a documentary she made called 3 Gates of Splendor, note that they're wearing the proper suits. You have a birthday suit, no clothes at all. So they were wearing no clothes. Okay, next slide. The man that I am talking to on the right is one of the killers. As I said, there were 10 men in the tribe, and all of them went to ambush the 5 white men. They became our friends. They were kind to us. When they had extra food, they offered it to us, extra fish, extra monkey meat. They taught me to suck the brains out of a monkey, after it had been roasted, of course. So he was one of the killers, and they were perfectly peaceful and kind to us, and we're very, very thankful for those 2.5 years we got to live with them. Dayuma, one of the Aucas, had fled the tribe many years before. She had been with Quichuas, and they all wore this style of clothing, same top, navy blue skirt. And so Dayuma and Rachel decided that all the Aucas needed to wear clothing. My mother was not for changing their culture. She was there simply to bring the gospel. But Rachel and Dayuma felt they should all wear clothes, so they started bringing clothes for the Aucas to put on. Next slide. This is Barbara Udarian, This is Roger Udarian and his wife, Barbara, and their little boy. And she had just that boy when her husband was killed, but she was expecting her second baby. Oh, I'm sorry, don't see the little girl. They have 2 children, and that is all they had. Yeah. Next slide. This is Marge Saint, young, and Marge Saint, older. Minkai was one of the killers, and Steve Saint got to know him very well because Steve went to Ecuador and lived with the Aucas for 1.5 years. And Minkai became a very, very dear friend, and Steve Saint's children called Minkai their grandfather because he had actually killed Nate Saint. They figured out from the description of the men that he was the one that actually speared Nate Saint. But because of Christianity, because of Christ, he had, of course, asked for forgiveness and wanted to be Steve Saint's friend, and Marge Saint, of course, became his friend too. Out of the 5 widows, there are only 2 still living, Olive Fleming and Barbara Udarian. Let's go to the next slide. This is Mary Lou McCulley and her husband, Ed. She is crying in the right-hand picture because she was being interviewed by Steve Saint for another documentary called Beyond the Gates. And she was telling the story of when the men went. And so that's why she has tears. They had 2 boys, and she was expecting her 3rd when her husband was killed. Next slide. This is Olive Fleming, Pete and Olive on the left, and this is her now. She lives near Wheaton, Illinois, so not too far from here. Okay, next slide. This is me and my mother. My mother got dementia when she was about 75, and she died in 2015. I loved reading to her since she didn't read much to herself anymore after she got dementia. Next slide. That's it. End of the show. Okay. And we're supposed to stop when? I need some sign from somebody when we're supposed to stop. It is 3:25. Okay. All right. Thank you all for listening. And may I just remind you that obedience to God is far, far more joyful than giving in to your feelings. So if you read the Word of God and you follow Christ, you will be a happy person. And that's why I wanted to title my talk, God wants you to be happy, or happiness is what God wants. And I'm truly happy not because I've lost my mother and father, but the fact that I know Jesus, the one that they served. I want you all to be happy too. So choose to obey him. Thank you.